So thank you for joining us for Waterbody Health Benefits of Natural Conservation District, or WCCD for short. I'm Summer. I'm the Washtenaw County Conservation District Community Forester and your host for tonight. And I'm joined by Drew Mark Wilson, WCCD's Outreach Coordinator, who is behind the scenes and helping me manage the webinar and in-person screening here at Bridgewater Township Hall. So we have a small crowd with us tonight, hoping a few more come in as we get started. So for those who don't know us, the WCCD is a local unit of state government. We were formed in 1948 with the mission to assist Washtenaw County residents with the conservation, management, and wise use of natural resources. County residents passed a millage in 2020, which has allowed us to expand our capacity and services. And I want to just quickly highlight a few of our upcoming events. So we have a Community Trees pilot project examining the distribution and services that trees provide in 4 municipalities: Bridgewater Township, Sharon Township, Ypsilanti Township, and the city of Ypsilanti. So if you live in any of those areas, please follow the link in the chat that I think Drew's putting in right now. And if you are in person, we have included it on the back of your clipboard. On February 1st, please join us for a webinar with Doug Talame and Michael Koss to discuss Michigan's oaks. And on March 9th, please join us for an in-person seminar on maintaining and restoring native plant gardens with Vern Stevens at the University of Michigan Mackay Botanical Gardens. And WCCD's spring tree and shrub sale is now open at our online store. So please see the chat for that link as well. And finally, please save the date for the Native Plant Expo and Marketplace on June 4th. And you can register for all of these events on our website or by calling our office. And we have added that information to the chat as well. So before we get started with the presentation, I just want to outline how the event will work. So all virtual attendees are muted and you're not visible. To submit a question, please use the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen. And WCCD staff will reply to you in the Q&A window, or will ask your question live to our presenter at the conclusion of the presentation. We are recording this webinar and we will post it to our YouTube page. So if you need to leave tonight and can't stick around for all the questions, you can easily watch it later and kind of fast forward to the question and answer part. For in-person attendees, you are not visible, but please know that the mic might pick up any sound that you make. And in-person attendees, we've also given you a blank piece of paper. If you'd like to write down any specific questions, you can ask Eric at the end of the presentation as well. So now we'll get to our main presentation, Waterbody Health Benefits of Natural Living Shorelines. Our presenter tonight is Erick Elgin, an aquatic ecologist and water resources educator with Michigan State University Extension. He promotes and researches the wise use, protection, and restoration of our freshwater systems. Erick's recent efforts focus on aquatic plants, lake ecology, natural shorelines, invasive species, and lake monitoring. Erick also helps lead Michigan's volunteer lake monitoring program, the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, and Michigan's Natural Shoreline Partnership. Erick has a Master's of Science in Aquatic Ecology from the University of Calgary and a Bachelor's of Science in Natural Resources Management and Water Resources Management from the University of Minnesota. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Erick. I will turn it over to you now.
Perfect, thank you. I'll get my presentation up. Just making sure, is everything correct?
Yes, we can see it here in Bridgewater.
The virtual world, I hope you can see this as well. And I see looks good in a message and it sounds good. Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. Wow, what a spread of folks and presenters that the Conservation District is putting. Doug Tallamy and Mike Cost and Vern, they're all great folks. So I definitely am going to try to see some of those presentations as well. So as Summer mentioned, my name is Erick Elgin, an aquatic ecologist with MSU Extension. That bio was good. I have many hats. I'm in Extension, but I have a couple pertinent partnerships and groups that I'm a part of for this presentation. And one of those is the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. And that partnership is a culmination of state agencies, nonprofits, academics, and private organizations all coming together to address the loss of lake shorelines across the state of Michigan. That's one of the #1 stressors that I'll be talking about today. And then also noting is our stream and lake monitoring programs. That's the MyCore stream monitoring and the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. If you're interested in getting your hands wet, stream monitoring and lake monitoring is for you. It's a great way to know your lake and stream a little bit better, and it's a lot of fun. So tonight, I'm going to be, it's kind of a broad presentation because I'm going to be covering a bit about lakes and a bit about streams. I am a little bit more heavy on lakes, which is my expertise, but I will also be covering streams. But in particular for streams, I'll be looking more about agricultural streams. So let's get started. So this is a broad view, but it's a really important one and something that will be kind of mentioned throughout my presentation, in that what we do on land impacts the water. And so what we have here on the left is a map of Michigan showing pre-European settlement vegetation and kind of the main groups. So for example, the bluish is a beech maple forest. We'll have some savanna type ecosystems in there, as well as then as we go north, we get into our coniferous forests dominated more by pine. But then as we move into our present, much of this has changed. We do still have a lot of our coniferous forests in the north, but in the southern half of the state, we have converted our landscape into an urban environment shown in red. And then in this tan color is in agriculture. And so what we do on land impacts the water. So when we've converted our landscape from dominated by natural ecosystems and into a modified landscape, we've now impacted the water. And just quickly mentioning, in our urban environments, we've paved over the ground. So when water falls, it shoots off of the surface into our storm drains. Our storm drains are sometimes connected to water treatment plants, but oftentimes are not. And so then the water hits the pavement, goes into the storm drain, and then goes into our waterways, often unfiltered or untreated. And so that gives us a problem. That's called urban stormwater. Also in our urban environments, we've channelized, we've paved over, we've filled, we've lost a lot of our water habitat. When we go into our agricultural environment, we have removed, or at least parts of the year, there's not much vegetation on our soil. And so when water or when precipitation falls, we can get erosion. And of course, there's agricultural practices out there that can minimize some of the consequences of no vegetation on the surface. There's still quite a bit. And so we have water moving the soil off, eroding, creating gullies and sheet erosion. And then also that water is carrying things. So it's moving the sediment and sedimenting into our waterways. And then I just wanted to show here, and this is a tile drain outlet into a drainage ditch. So not only does water run off the surface, there is some infiltration. While water percolates through and permeates through the soil, it can pick up nutrients and other contaminants. And when it goes into these drainage pipes that are underneath agricultural fields, it can then shoot them into our ag ditches and then into our natural streams and then into our lakes and so on and so forth. And that's what's key is what does that stormwater hold? It's not just water. Stormwater from our urban and agricultural environments hold nutrient pollution, pesticide pollution, oils, metals, salt if it's near a road. It could be bacteria like E. coli coming from animal waste or from point source human waste, and then also sediment. But tonight, I'm not going to be talking about the broader landscape. Instead, I'm going to be focusing more on the immediate adjacent land to our water. And so on our agricultural streams, what we sometimes have is agriculture functioning right up to a waterway. And what we have here is a lack of habitat because of the lack of perennial vegetation in a more sloped natural bank. We have erosion issues, we have bank failure, and then also runoff. So as water is running off of the surface, it's collecting things and then being deposited in our water systems. Now to take a quick glimpse at lakes across the state, we're in a tough situation. What we see here is a map from the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, and the red represent lakes. The red dots represent lakes with high shoreland disturbance. And you can see kind of this southern part of the southern half of the state, southern 3/4 of the state, there are a lot of red. A study done not too long ago showed that actually around here and south, 70% of lakes in southern Michigan are intensely developed. So many homes per mile of shoreline, whereas the blue is low. So there's quite a bit of shoreline disturbance. And now this is at the landscape scale. And I should describe what is shoreline development. This is where homes are put in, vegetation is removed, and impervious surfaces like roads and driveways are put in. So that was at the landscape scale. But when we zoom in, what does this truly look like? What does it mean? How developed are our lakes? And here's an example from Southwest Michigan to kind of show how dramatic the change has been. So the next few slides are courtesy of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So here's an image of the lake in 2014, a satellite image here, or a picture of it. And here it is overlaid with imagery from 1938. So much of the landscape around is fairly similar. We have agricultural lands now and then, but now what we're going to do is zoom into different parts of the shoreline to show the change from 38 to 2014. So first we're going to zoom up here. Okay, so in 1938, here is the northern part of the lake. It looks like a wetland here, and even emergent vegetation coming out into the lake. Emergent vegetation like cattails, maybe hardstem bulrush, arrowhead. It could be a mix of wetland species. So this is what it was like in 1938, and here we are in 2014. So as you can see, a pretty dramatic change. This wetland had canals dredged in it, most likely the spoils put up into a mound so that you can have drier land. You can see all of this shoreline has been developed, and just judging by how tight the houses are, there might be like 45-foot lots and a house put on every single lot. So here, just to get another look, here it was in 1938. And here we are today. So you can imagine that this type of heavy development isn't seen on, the whole landscape showed that this is a rural area of Michigan. But when you have density like this is like a very densely populated town. So let's look at another part of the lake. So once again, here's a wetland that's adjacent to a lake, or the lake. And here we are today. Again, kind of the same situation where it looks like dredging occurred, spoils put up, and then homes laid down on it. And this shows a different view. So this is not a wetland shoreline. This is an upland shoreline. But what we're going to see in this change is the hardening of a shoreline. And what I mean by hardening of the shoreline, you can see a very distinct line that is here that wasn't, and this is the construction of seawalls here. And when we look at wetlands, so it's a natural coupling. Lakes are low on the landscape, and so you would typically see wetlands along our lakes. And so here's a different lake, and the yellow is representing the 69 acres of wetland that was present in 1940. And then here we are showing the remaining wetland today. So from around 70 acres to 19 acres. And here this just kind of represents what was lost. So here's in red is the 50 acres that has been lost. So this change in vegetation, this increase in impervious surfaces from our homes, driveways, garages, you can see that it's this immediate shoreline, but then also there's the typical next row of houses just beyond that first row. This change in vegetation has created a lot of changes to our water bodies and to the areas around them. And I say change in vegetation because it's not a total loss in vegetation. It's more of all of our native diverse species that we have on the shoreline are replaced by lawn grass. And what trees remain are typically planted by us and don't necessarily fit into North America. As for example, here's a weeping willow, so a non-native tree used, as well as other ornamental species that are planted. So much of the habitat is highly altered. And this is the loss of habitat. This results in increased runoff, increased erosion, which I'll get into soon, and an increase in pollutant loading like sediments and nutrients and much more. And then I just wanted to show for ag areas, fairly similar things. So there are some floodplain forests that still remain along some of our larger river channels, but I tried to find, here's a natural river or stream that was likely channelized and is now more of an agricultural ditch. And you can see that there is little, from this far out, you can see if there's no vegetation, but there's little vegetation along these stream corridors. So this change in vegetation and then in ag areas, also open soil results in much of the same as we see in our lakes. And this is dramatic. When we have a loss of vegetation, we have a loss of critical habitat for certain species. So on lakes, for example, when we see development and hardened shorelines along lakes, we see a disappearance of certain frog species. We also see not the number of birds don't change from a urban lake to a natural lake. Like the numbers, if you did a bird count, remain fairly similar. But what changes is the species that occur there. When what we see in our natural shorelines are bird species that require specific habitat. They could be ground nesting birds like loons, or it could be the belted kingfisher, as you see here, that require certain perches like osprey as well. What they're replaced by, or what changes in an urban lake, is suburban birds. So we'll see robins and chickadees, cowbirds. And then of course, the shoreline, we don't necessarily stop right at the line between land and water. Instead, it actually extends into the water, and we call this kind of the shoreland. And all fish species in Michigan utilize that shallow area at some point in their life cycle. And so when you alter shorelines and you remove maybe native vegetation within the water, when you remove the wood that has trees that have fallen in the water, those things all impact habitat and therefore impact our fish. And then just thinking about our game species, and that as we remove those fence rows and those riparian buffers around our agricultural ditches and streams, we can lose that last remaining habitat for some of our game species that some of us enjoy hunting or viewing, such as the pheasant. And when we look at water quality, here's a great example from a lake. So the impacts of development and all this shoreline alteration is external loading. So nutrients coming from the landscape and into the water. And what are the consequences of that external loading? So what we have here is a study that looked at 3 different types of lakes. They have undeveloped lakes, lakes that have sewer around them, and then lakes that have septic systems around them. And what we have here is total phosphorus. So phosphorus is an important nutrient for aquatic life. It is typically the most limiting nutrient to algae and plant growth in lakes. And so you can see in undeveloped lakes, it is present, but in much less amount compared to sewered and then septics. And then so as a result of that extra phosphorus, what do we see in algae? We see a very similar trend. And this would not be unexpected to see this trend. The more phosphorus, the more algae is typically what you get. And algae in itself is not a bad thing, but what it can do is change the aesthetics. You may have an ew feeling. There's also certain algae that are called cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria can produce toxins that could injure you, could kill your dog if they drink it. And then also the buildup of algae through the years because of external loading issues can start to settle onto the bottom. The algae will die, fall to the bottom, and then bacteria decompose them, and you'll get a loss of oxygen, which then changes fish. So what we do on land impacts the water. And just to talk a little bit about lawns and comparing them to wooded lots. And although the numbers don't match, you can make some similar conclusions with agricultural land as well. But looking just at lawns, lawns can produce up to 10 times more runoff, so surface runoff, than woods. And here's an example of a study done by the United States Geological Survey, I believe in Wisconsin, and just showing how when water falls on lawns compared to woods, the woods absorb a lot of it compared to the lawns, which might be compacted, which allowed the water to run off of it. And something that I thought was really interesting as well is when you look at the shallow groundwater. So this is the water that is infiltrated a little bit into the ground, but is still moving with gravity. And so the shallow groundwater underneath lawns had 3 to 4 times higher levels of nitrate and total phosphorus. So I mentioned total phosphorus, but nitrogen is also a key nutrient in aquatic systems and is typically like the second most important nutrient for algal and plant growth. What else about lawns? Well, there's little wildlife value. So like I mentioned earlier, is that we have replaced a diverse amount of species that would have been there with different types of native grasses, sedges, rushes, and flowers. And we replaced them with lawn. Although there's little wildlife value, there is still some wildlife value, and that's for example, for geese. Canada goose love lawns. They love eating the grass. They also love being able to look around. So the thought is that geese also like our lawns because they can look all around and there's nothing, a predator is not waiting for them in the tall grass. And so they feel safe there. And then I mentioned increased runoff. And then the big thing that is a major issue is erosion. Lawn roots are weak. They're weak and small, so they don't have much ability to hold the soil in laterally or deep. And when you're on a lake, you get a constant wave action. And if you're on a stream, there's flow, there's directional flow that's constant. And so without a good root system, the soil starts to erode away and you can get bank failure. And here's a common site that we see on our inland lakes throughout the state when the vegetation has been removed and replaced by lawns, is that you eventually get an undercutting of the toe of your slope, and then you'll get the failure of the bank. Classically or traditional landscaping approach would be, well, we need to stop this erosion. And so we would have hardened the the shoreline. And so on the left is a pretty extreme example of a seawall, and on the right is a pretty extreme example of rock riprap. But just to show a point, these are not seen as best practices, although they do stop erosion. So that is true. They stop erosion of your hillside or of your slope. There's some consequences. For example, it changes the wave energy. So I'll kind of demonstrate it with my mouse. I hope you can see this, my mouse on the screen next to this big boulder here. So when wave energy comes in, the direction of the waves don't get a chance to roll up and have friction reduce the waves as it would on a natural shoreline. Instead, the waves come and hit and then scour out the bottom. And so in some places you can actually go out here, and the deepest part of this shoreline is actually right at the seawall or right at the rock riprap base, because the wave energy is going down and eating away. Another thing waves do is called wave flanking. And so the energy comes in and it moves laterally. And so what might happen, and this picture doesn't show it well, but if waves come in, they move laterally and will start to eat away at the adjacent shoreline with a lot of energy because it's focused right on there. And so there's still there are problems with waves, just not on your shoreline directly. It removes habitat. For example, we have something called a turtle test, and you can picture it as a turtle's in the water and it needs to lay its eggs. And so it comes up to the seawall, and you'd ask the question, can the turtle get up onto the upland and lay its eggs? And if the answer is no, well, then there's there's something wrong with the shoreline, because you don't want to be a barrier to species that require movement between the two uplands and lake. And of course, they cost quite a bit of money. So that was kind of a lot of a downer. There's a lot of negative things happening there, but it doesn't have to be. There is an alternative, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation. That's landscaping with nature, or working with nature. This is where I'll be focusing the rest of the presentation on plants, plants, plants. That's what's key when we're thinking about our shoreline habitats and stopping erosion, being aesthetically pleasing, as you can see here. It's all centered on plants. So when we design with nature, we're typically looking at 3 tiers of vegetation. So we have our canopy, which is our trees. We have a shrub understory, and then we have our forbs, our grasses, so flowers and grasses. The combination of these plants, or types of plants, broad groups of plants, do a lot. They stabilize the banks and lake sediments. They absorb nutrients, they provide habitat, and they reduce runoff. So they stabilize banks and lake sediments because their roots, some species root out laterally and create a mattress effect and intertwine amongst each other, really holding the soil in place. Also, some plants grow deep roots, and those go deeper in, and that's great to have on slopes, because now that's helping connect the different soil profiles, the different layers of soil, keeping it in place as the water is moving through it or over it. The stabilizing lake sediments is important too, and you can think of this as even in a stream, having plants in there is, when the plants are there, they hold down the lake bottom or the stream bottom. So when there's the flow of energy from the waves, they don't have a chance to resuspend the sediments. They absorb nutrients. So when they slow down water, so they're reducing runoff, because so when water runs down the slope, their stems slow down the water and allow the water to then infiltrate down into the soil, where it'll be available for the plants. And of course, they provide the pivotal habitat for the variety of species that utilize our lake and stream shores. But something to keep in mind is, to make this a sustainable approach, you have to have the goal of balancing your needs with the protection of the water body. So someone here might say, well, I don't want a big buffer strip in front of my property. Well, that's okay. although it'd be great if you could have a buffer strip, if you can do something that fits what you're thinking of for your aesthetic, but then also helps the lake, even those little things make a difference. This is a great picture from Wisconsin Healthy Lakes program, which shows now a classic cottage, but still mowed lawn, still maybe a little beachier, but here they've made part of it into a native plant buffer. They've allowed trees or put in trees for fish habitat, and that's called fish sticks. And they've also done some work in their upland, maybe putting in a rain garden. And so you can still, you don't have to have a totally natural shoreline to still make some big improvements to the water body. And this is the same for ag systems. This is a little different because where you're trying to think about, for a lake shoreline on a residential property, you're thinking about balancing what you're seeking out in your yard, and then also thinking about the water quality of your lake. But when you're in an agricultural environment, you're also balancing your business. Your business is farming, and so you have to consider the cost benefit of removing some land from production to put in there, and so you have to think about what does that mean, and how much can you do, and what benefits are out there. And I'll be talking about all of those here shortly. So let's think about lakes for a little bit, and we're going to go through a few different designs. So, and then also landscaping options and choices. So first, if you have it, then keep it. Preserve the vegetation you have. And so if you already have some nice trees growing up there, if you have, looks like hard stem bulrush going out into the water, you have it, keep it. It's going to be great. It's native to your area, hopefully, so identify it to make sure. But you don't always have to do something. Instead, it's more of protect what you have. And this can look like a variety of things. Here's a great example from the center of the state, where here's a house that's tucked in quite a bit, but you can see they still have a beautiful view of the lake. When you're out on the water, their house is up in here, and so you can see the privacy that's given, but they don't lack access to the lake, where they still have a dock and they still have full access. But what if you don't have it? What if you're starting from a lawn and you want to make a difference? What the goal here is to increase your diversity of plants on the shoreline. So what's some options here? A really simple option is to just create a Nomozone. Stop mowing along the shoreline. Now, this is free, so that's wonderful. If you live on a fairly natural lake or a natural area, you can get a lot of great vegetation that comes up on your shoreline. Now, there's a threat of invasive species, though. You might get Phragmites growing up there, or purple loosestrife, or maybe buckthorn, a shrub that's invasive. And so you do risk having invasive seeds come up from the seed bank. But I've seen many times where there's a lot of native seeds that are just waiting to not be mowed over and then come up. But keep vigilant for invasive species, because you would want to address it before they become too big of an issue. But what if a Nomozone isn't the right fit for you, or you want a more manicured buffer, or you want certain species, you want a certain aesthetic? Well, that's when you're going to go into a planting. And we promote native plantings, so native species, because there's lots of benefits to native plants, from the connections to the food web. The next speaker for the Conservation District is Doug Tallamy, and he's put a lot of effort into showing how important native plants are to the full food web of the world around us. Also, they are adapted for our area. And so that means they grow really well and they require less maintenance. And then also they have a lot of the attributes we're looking for, in that, sure, they're pretty, but they also have awesome root systems that can really hold in your shoreline. And there's many plants to choose from. and it's quite great. You can make it as more like a garden that's more manicured, or you can make it more natural. So here's an example of a narrow buffer strip that has a lot of different flowers in there, but then also have some familiar plants into the lake here. That's arrowhead, might be pickerel weed in here. This is Joe Pye weed. This looks like a vervain. And then you have some different species of coneflower and black-eyed Susans. And something to keep in mind is, I think I might even have a picture. Yeah, I'll go next. Something to keep in mind is that flowers are great and should definitely be used, but don't forget grasses. There's a lot of benefits to grasses that complement flowers. So when we think about our plant choices, think about grasses and sedges. They have deep and shallow roots, so they can be really fibrous and really hold in that soil. They're great at nutrient uptake. Some species send multiple stems up in a bunch or even spread out. That helps slow the flow of runoff. So as water is running off of the surface and hits a buffer strip with lots of grasses, it slows the water down, allowing for it to seep into the ground as well as deposit its sediments and other contaminants. It's also a nice winter feature. So if you're looking for aesthetics here, little bluestem, for example, turns a purple color and copper color in the fall, and it retains that kind of that copper color into the winter, and it has strong enough stems that they stay up. And so it actually is can be a nice ornamental feature in the winter as well as habitat cover. And something I always mention when thinking about the design of our landscape is think about the grasses. This green, beautiful green texture is a great canvas for the flowers to be put into. And so if you just had flowers, now that might be great in some circumstances, but it's really nice to have that backdrop of the green texture that the grasses provide. When we look at flowers, those also can be provide the fibrous and deep roots, which would aid in erosion and infiltration. They're beautiful, of course. They do have less stems than grasses, and so they may not be, depending on the depth of your buffer strip, they may not be as effective at reducing runoff. But now, although plants are key, sometimes you're in a situation that you need a little bit more help. And what we promote as the best practice for this is bioengineering. And so bioengineering uses native plants, so it still uses plants, but also biodegradable materials and sometimes rock and sometimes some wood to recreate a stable shoreline that mimics natural shorelines. And so what you see here is a core log, which is a biodegradable log made of coconut fiber, staked into the eroding shoreline. We did this here, or this is commonly used, because if we just planted into the shoreline, the waves would come in and rip out the plants and they wouldn't have enough time to establish and get their roots in. And so this coconut fiber log stabilizes the shoreline, slows down erosion for the first 3 to 5 years, and the plants then take over from there. Those 3 to 5 years allows the plants to mature, roots to take hold and intertwine with one another, and then they themselves can hold in the shoreline. And this is erosion control blanket. So you've probably seen this along construction sites on the road or on any slopes. And this is used, again, to hold the soil in place long enough for plants to take hold. And here's a design aspect of that. So here's a shoreline sloping down, here's the water level, and here's the coconut core log that would hold in the bottom slope. But rock is sometimes needed. So if you're in an area with a lot of wave energy, either you're on a lake that has a lot of boating or you're on a larger lake that has big waves, you might need to have rock put in. The difference between this rock and typical rock riprap is put in at like a 2-to-1 slope, is the classic design. But if you can make that a more gradual slope, what happens is that this more mimics a natural shoreline. And so when waves come in, it will come up here, friction will slow down those waves, and the sediment will deposit in here and on top of the rock and through all the crevices. And so you actually over the years, you will lose sight of these rocks, and it'll become more of like a natural shoreline. Just to talk, because this is an important feature for lakes, is water level changes. We've been going through a lot of them. We've had a few years ago, lots of precipitation, and so therefore we were at really high levels. And then now just recently, we've been having some lower levels in parts of the state. And so that's completely normal. Lakes go up and down through the decades. The plant communities will react by, sometimes if the trees are too low, because it's been in the low season, the trees will die with high water. As the waters recede, those trees will likely fall into the water and become great fish habitat. And then the plants react by, certain species now are able to grow in the wetland areas instead of being submersed in the water. So when we think about the design aspects of our buffer strips, we want them to be deeper, which would allow for water levels to go up and down. And if you have a diverse amount of species in there, they'll be able to handle that. And so the general rule, and I say general because there's lots of depends, is a 35-foot buffer. That's how deep from the water's edge up to upland. So now we're just going to go kind of quickly through some examples, and I'll point out a few things when thinking about our goals of natural shoreline landscaping. So that's erosion protection, water quality protection, improved habitat, some water level fluctuation adaptation, and then something called the sense of place and beauty. So here's a classic shoreline where vegetation was removed, the shoreline was eroding. They placed in these core logs at the toe of the slope and then planted native species in there, and this is what it looks like today. Here's another picture of a native plant buffer. So this is a great example of a shoreline that is a balanced approach, where this person wanted a lawn. They still wanted to keep their really nice manicured lawn. But now, because of their buffer strip, as the water runs off of the lawn, the buffer will help reduce the sediments from entering to the lake, as well as uptake the nutrients that are coming off of the lawn. You also have erosion control due to those deep roots. And there's some beauty and privacy that you can get from all of this types of landscaping. Here's a good before and after of a typical rock garden. And this person didn't have much erosion issues, but wanted more habitat and wanted to do the right thing. And so here's, and again, is the core log. Here's the erosion control fabric with plants newly planted in there. And this just gets to the point of, what's the phrase? Don't let the best be the enemy of the good. And so if you can't do a full buffer, even doing something it can make a big difference. And so here's an example of a corner property garden where it doesn't cover the entire frontage of your shoreline. Here's another example of a balanced approach where they still have a beautiful home. They have a small beach. They even have their lawn. So we have runoff and stuff, but because of all these different landscaping choices, the runoff is much reduced. There's a lot of erosion control, and then there's all of the benefits to the water. And of course, when you look at this, what's nice is this is a blend of native and horticultural plants. So you have native trees, you have some native sedges on the shoreline, but then also if you look back here, these are hostas, maybe vinca back there as well. And so you can have a blending of that because you may not have access to native plants. I'll just move on from that one. Let's go here. So also you can make some choices on improved habitat. So our lakes, including our rivers and streams, they used to have a lot of wood fallen down in them. But through time, humans have this reaction of saying we don't want wood in the water, so we've pulled them all out. Well, these are really important features for the shoreline, from shoreline erosion mitigation to turtle logs to habitat for fish. And this practice is called fish sticks. And so if you're interested in that, the state is promoting this heavily, and it's really interesting. You stake it in. So here's a post that's in your upland area, and this is just this is temporary. And so you tie a tree to it so it doesn't drift away. And once the tree becomes waterlogged, you take it off and it won't move. And then it will provide all the habitat benefits. And then that sense of place and beauty. It's when you live on a lake, when you live on a stream, I often ask, you probably want to have that feel of living on a lake and stream. And that feel doesn't always mimic the suburban houses that we see in our urban environments. And so what I try to convince people, or to show people, is that you want to have some cedar trees. You want to have some species on there that give you that lake feel, that sense of place, other than that if you're in some normal subdivision of an urban area. For example, like this. Okay, so moving a little bit into just briefly touching on some extra considerations for agricultural streams. It's important to think that, so streams, unlike what I was mentioning with lakes, there is directional flow, and that flow can be constant. And so some of the practices definitely can work for streams as well, but there's some extra considerations because of the flow. Also to think about is cost to producers. You might have, if you're a farmer in southern Michigan, you could have a 1/4 mile or a 1/2 mile of drainage ditch or agricultural stream going through. So that's a lot of frontage. And so to remove that out of production, you have to look at the cost benefits and what are you looking to do. Also, what are your goals? Are your goals water protection? Is it hunting? Maybe it's just wildlife in general. And once you kind of have an idea yourself, what's great is that there are many government programs and groups who would help along, including the Conservation District, but also the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the FSA, the Farm Service Agency, who administer the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. Let's just go a little bit into designing with nature when thinking about our riparian areas. So trees are really important. And I guess that's what I'm going to go into, is that there's two broad categories of riparian buffers for ag areas, and that can be our treed side, or we can go a native grass or grasses buffer. And so this kind of splits it in half. And I'll go into that. So how does it work? As water is, imagine if your crop was here, as water is running off, the trees are intercepting that water. They are allowing it to percolate down into the soil. Once it's in the soil with the roots, it can create an environment that eliminates nitrogen through a bacteria process, and also utilize those nutrients, slow down that water so you don't get as much force entering into the water body. It shades the water, which helps with water temperature, and that's important for habitat. And then also just provides habitat for a lot of different things. So these have been shown to improve stream bank stability. That's the other thing, is these roots and these tree canopies are really helping hold down the stream bank. They're effective at reducing suspended particles, and they can be good with phosphorus reductions. However, in fallow times, so in the winter times, they can be a source. And so there's lots of depends there. It depends on your site conditions. Is it steep? Is it a wetland? So on and so forth. Now, if this is something that is interest to you, some considerations is that it's not as effective in tile drained fields. So if this is a tile drained field up here and is shooting off, these roots are no longer helping as much with the reduction of nutrients, because the nutrients are bypassing the buffer and going through a drain tile. These have been shown to be better than grass buffers for nitrogen removal. And of course, there's a cost to this. How many trees and shrubs can be put into a buffer if you have a 1/2 mile of stream frontage? But that's where what's great is for technical help as well as cost or benefits for cost sharing, you can go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service or the Farm Service Agency. And there's many programs, including the Conservation Reserve Program, that can help cover the costs of implementation. And then also, and this is what's interesting, is some of the programs give you rental rates. And so if you are taking land out of production, the government will fund you for that with rental payments. And you can talk to these agencies to learn more about that. Just talking a little bit about grass buffer. So this uses, sometimes it can be native grasses, but others, it can be a hay mix, it can be brome. Native is preferable, but there's lots of benefits to the others, the non-native species as well. And this does kind of the same thing. As water is running off of our ag fields, it hits these buffers, slows down that water, allowing it to percolate into the soil where nutrients can be used up and converted. Also, what's nice about these is that the grasses can grow into the ditch itself, which helps with water flow and habitat, and then also nutrient uptake. Once again, it's not as effective for tiled drain fields because all that water gets bypassed through the buffer. Now, I've talked a lot about the plants side of things, but there is a tremendous amount of other details that can go into this. For example, how is the slope vertical? Is the slope more natural? A big conservation practice is a two-stage ditch, which allows for a floodplain to be developed, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different details there. So to finish up, I just wanted to showcase some of our resources out here. Here's the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. This has a ton of different things. It has information on permits. It talks about erosion control basics. And then also what's really helpful, it has plant lists. And so if you're interested in knowing what plants would be great along shorelines or in a rain garden or in other circumstances, there's a great list there. And also where to get native plants. The Conservation District has native plant sales, but if you're not during that season, there are still many companies across the state that sell them through the growing season. We have a new product out there called Shoreline Living. It's a magazine. It's quite nice here. There it is. And oh, it's not like that. Well, anyways, it's a very nice magazine. And it tells the stories of multiple families and people who have made the decision to have a more natural shoreline. If you are curious about this or you want it for your organization or to give to neighbors, feel free to contact me. If you want to learn more about what Extension does for our lakes and streams and watersheds, we have a nice program catalog of all of our different resources and programs. You can access that on our website as well. And also what's starting up right now is we have a 6-week online course called Introduction to Lakes. And that's where we cover some basic lake ecology all the way up to shorelines and law and civic engagement along lakes. That's going on right now. The registration, excuse me, has passed for this year, but we will likely be giving it again in the winter of next year. So thank you very much. It's a lot of information in a little bit of time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your presentation. That was great. We have a couple of questions that came in. I believe the first one was about permitting, and they were wondering if you could explain when a permit is needed, if it's needed for just planting plants, or if you need it for the bioengineering that you mentioned, or what kind of situations do you need it for?
Yeah, so when looking at lakes, and I'm just going to show, so here's so when you do anything, first of all, so your permitting agency is EGLE, the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. That's the state permitting agency. And when you are doing anything in the lake, And what they define as in the lake is at the ordinary high water mark. So that's HOHWM, the ordinary high water mark. If you're doing anything at the ordinary high water mark or into the lake, you likely need a permit if you are disturbing the bottom or changing or constructing something there. So if you are going to put in a core log at the ordinary high water mark, you would need a permit. These permits are really easy to get if you're designing it correctly, because and they are cheap because the state would love to see these put in, so they are promoting it. And if you are just planting in your upland areas, you do not need a permit. Now, if you're planning to shave say this bank is too vertical and you want to make it more sloped, there will be a permit process with the soil and water permit group within your county. And sometimes that's the Drain Commission, sometimes that's within the conservation district. And so you'd have to look at your county to know the permitting process if you are going to disturb a lot of soil. There's a lot of depends in there, of course, and so you can always contact Eagle, and that you would, if you go into Google, type in environment, Great Lakes and energy, and then type in land water staff, I think you'll be able to find a map with that information. Or feel free to email me or call me, and I'll be able to help connect you to the right person.
Thanks, Eric. The next question we have is about swamp loosestrife. And this person was wondering if there's any advantages or downsides to planting it. It is something that we are selling at the WCCD spring sale.
Yeah, so swamp loosestrife is spectacular. If you it's spectacular at that ordinary high water mark. What happens here with swamp loosestrife is that when it's planted, I don't know if you can see this. I'll say if I'm the shoreline, it'll grow out into the lake a little bit and then curve upward. It's a nice little flower, and then it sends roots down. And what's nice about it going out into the water a little bit, then coming up, is that it gives a little bit more cushion for those waves. So when the waves come in, it's hitting those stems that can then dampen it before it hits the actual soil of the shoreline. Are there any consequences? So it's a great plant to use. It can be aggressive though. So in some circumstances, like I've gotten calls from lakes saying that it's taking over a particular area. I can't help you into what are those characteristics, because I've seen it in all sorts of ways where it grew well or just grew more contained. So yeah, so swamp loosestrife, just to finish that, it is a native. It's not the purple loosestrife that you hear of. It's in a different genus altogether.
Great, thank you, Eric. We have a question from someone in person here, and I think Karen, if you actually want to come, I think you need to stand away from the speakers. There might be too much kind of feedback.
Hi, Eric. I live in Bridgewater Township on a lake called Columbia Lake that is basically, okay, can you hear me?
Yes, it's a little muffled, so I might have to repeat, but I'm listening.
All right, I'm taking my mask down and walking inside. I live on a lake that is practically all native and natural. There's only 5 year-round houses on the lake. It's very small. It's beautiful woodland and swampland around it. Lots of native plants. And those of us that do live near the water do our best to protect it with buffer zones and such. But
Perfect.
we still have a horrible, horrible algae bloom from agricultural runoff, non-point source pollution, you might say. And it gets worse every year. This year we could hardly swim in our lake because it was so bad. And milfoil is coming in and making it very difficult to swim off our dock. because we have to rake away the milfoil in order to be able to swim back and forth. I don't know where to turn with this. I've tried the conservation district, and I think that's part of the reason you're here now, is speaking to us, addressing some of this. But we still have a horrible algae bloom and milfoil with very few landowners actually living on the lake. Any suggestions?
Is there a stream inlet?
There are numerous, what the Drain Commission calls drains coming in from agricultural fields in the area. And I know that they're producing corn and alfalfa, that sort of thing, sometimes soybeans.
And okay, so that's interesting. So you talked to the drain commissioner, so, and he said they're drained. So are they, if because I don't know if you know that if they're county drains, do you know if they're county drains?
They are.
Okay.
I used to work for MSU Extension.
Oh, great.
And I also worked for a short period of time for the Drain Commission. So I do understand all this that you're talking about.
Perfect. Yeah.
I'm still stymied at how to save this lake.
Yeah, and
Our county is interested in turning half of it into a preserve, but our township didn't agree with that. So I don't know where to turn to try to preserve this beautiful body of water, and the bald eagles and osprey and loons that call it home part-time or full-time, and made it my life's mission. So if you can help me with any advice, I will sing your praises.
Well, it's a tough situation. So I think, yeah, and so the first thing is, you know, this is a big conversation. So feel free to jot down my email, and what we can do is have time to have a conversation, because there's a lot to cover here, but I'll just give kind of a quick, some quick points. One thing is that as a county drain, and now just, and having a relationship with the drain commissioner, that's a nice step in a direction of maybe putting in best practices along the ag ditches, and having an understanding of which ditch is the worst might be important. So knowing how much phosphorus is coming in each of these ditches. And I say to do that because it'd be important to prioritize. You may not be able to do everything at once. And so might as well hit the ditch that is putting in the most phosphorus. And when you look at that, don't just look at, you know, so oftentimes it's just a water collection where you just scoop up the water and then you get a sense of how much phosphorus concentration is in that. But what would be a better idea is to get the flow with the water concentration of phosphorus, so that you get an understanding of loading. So you could have a big stream that has a low, a medium amount of phosphorus concentration, and you can have a small stream with high concentration. Well, when you look at loading, it might be that big stream that is loading more phosphorus, and then therefore should be focused on. And then, so working with the drain commissioner, it might be also important to reach out to the landowners who are adjacent to these streams, or these ag ditches, and creating a relationship with the lake residents, the drain commissioner, and those private landowners in saying, what can we do together? There are some lakes out there that I'm working with that I've encouraged to, the lakes themselves create a pot of money to help the farmer put in a best practice. And that relationship just shows goodwill on both sides, and it creates a really great situation. And so that's a direction I would initially go to, because you're right, addressing the non-point source pollution off of the landscape is key for the long-term condition of the lake. And that's just a piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Eric. That sounds like it's going to be a longer conversation between you.
Yes.
Sure. Make sure that he has your contact info. Another question, I know we're going over time here, but Eric very generously offered to stay a little late to answer some questions. So one more question, what to do if you have invasive species like Phragmites?
So you might want to remove them. But if you're going to remove them, you should have a plan. And then I'm going to give one depends before I finish this is it depends on how much is there. So are we talking about if it's just in front of your lake shoreline and there's Phragmites, is it 15 feet tall and 20 feet wide and covering your entire shoreline compared to are you just starting to see Phragmites? If you're just starting to see Phragmites move in, you can, there are different practices that you can use to eliminate it. And many of them use herbicide. If it's not very many, I've seen success where people cut the stem and then drip herbicide very carefully to not get it anywhere else and drip it inside of the cut stem. And doing that multiple times will get rid of it. But if you have it all over the place and you plan to remove it, you might need to bring in a contractor because that might be a lot of herbicide that you may not want to put out yourself. But then have a plan. So it's not just the removal of an invasive species. You'll have to think about what am I going to replace that vegetation with? Because if you remove the Phragmites, or let's say it's hybrid cattail or reed canary grass, all these that create really dense monocultures, if you just remove it without having a plan for restoration, you can open up the soil to erosion and you can create a really bad situation. And so when you remove the invasive species, think about planting native plants or whatever gardening landscaping choices you're going to do in its place. And if you're particularly interested in Phragmites, there's the Phragmites Collaborative, and you can type that into Google, or if you can't find it, email me. And I think they have practices on the large scale and then also management practices, I think at the homeowner scale, that they have best practices for removal.
Thanks, Eric. I'll also mention if you're in Jackson, Lenawee, or Washtenaw, there's a JLW SISMA. It focuses on invasive species removal, and they're really helpful. I think Drew is putting that information in the chat right now.
Perfect. Yeah, Shika, the director there, is great and has done a lot of things with water too. So that would be helpful.
Great. So another question is, who are the contacts or guidance on reestablishing lawns to perennials? This person doesn't live on a lake, but they have shallow natural ponds that come and go based on precipitation. I guess that sounds like vernal pools.
Cool. Okay, so you want to take a lawn to a more natural environment and you want resources? Was that the question? Sorry, just to make sure I have that right.
Yes, contacts for guidance on reestablishing lawns to perennials.
Well, I would reach out potentially. I don't know what I always say, reach out to your local folks first. And there might be somebody in the Washtenaw, if you're in Washtenaw County or whatever county you're in, the conservation districts are always a great start. They can have resources for you. They could have resources for local contractors who they know have done this sort of thing. And then that would be the other key part is if you find a list of so the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership has a list of native plant companies. So those companies aren't specific to shorelines, they're just native plant companies. Oftentimes, or sometimes, those companies also have restoration crews. And so they, for cost, they will come out and do that work on your property. Also, the DNR, they have the DNR, Audubon Society, a whole bunch of different groups have resources online and in PDFs that can help get you started in that direction.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, you can always reach out to Washtenaw County Conservation District. We can help you with that for sure. The last question we're going to take tonight, is it feasible to replace a steel seawall with a natural shoreline when neighbors on both sides have steel seawalls?
So it depends on the definition of feasible. So can you do it? Yes. But there would have to be some major design considerations. And I would really encourage to to work with the contractor who has done this sort of thing in the past. What may need to happen is, instead of a full replacement, if the seawall doesn't need to be replaced. So let's say you have a seawall and it's fully functional. What may be the case is that you leave it there, and then instead you put a buffer strip above it, which will mitigate some habitat for birds, for example. You still have the barrier to the water, but maybe you can create a turtle ramp. Those can be simple designs where it's wood going from the top of the seawall down into the water. In the water itself, you can potentially add some woody debris, so a downed tree. Think of it as like, it may seem like it would look messy in your, or here, I'll just go back and show. You could maybe put in a design like this, where you put in a tree in front of the seawall, anchor it into place. And that's a way to mitigate the impacts of that seawall. So, but you'd keep the seawall there because you're in a highly erosive area. But if you are still interested in fully removing that seawall, give us a call, contact us at the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, and we can help put you in touch with people who might have the skills to do so. There would be circumstances where it may not be possible to do it. So there's lots of depends.
Great. Thank you again, Eric. This was a great talk, and I appreciate you staying late to answer questions. And thank you to everyone who stayed late to listen. That concludes the end of our webinar. And hopefully we'll have Eric back again soon to dive deeper into this topic.
I'd love to be there in person, hopefully sometime in the future.
That sounds great.
Thank you, everyone.